Since the invention of the World Wide Web and the browser in the early 1990s, computer programs or applications that developers make could be split into two categories: web or browser-based apps which run on browsers, and desktop and native apps that are installed in and run directly on the device. Both of these categories of software applications or apps having their pros and cons. In this lesson, we will explore this a bit. When developing applications that are going to be used by users or people, you can either develop applications that will be accessed by the user through a browser. These are called web applications or web apps. Or you can develop applications that the user will download and install in their device. These are called native apps, typically in mobile devices, or desktop apps in PCs. Both the web apps and the native apps have their pros and cons, and we'll take a look at these, which will give us a basic idea of whether we should develop web apps or native apps for our specific application whenever we decide to develop an application. Let's look at native apps first. Some of the pros. Since native apps are developed specifically for the devices in which they are installed, they generally have more fuller access to the device's features and even hardware features. For example, accessing a smartphone's fingerprint scanner. They are usually faster. They can work offline and do not require a constant internet connection. Let's look at some of the cons. Users must first download and then install your app. This means it takes longer for a user to start using your app if, for instance, they simply want to try it out. In order for users to get the latest version of your app or to get updates, they have to manually update the application. This then means that not all users of your app are using the latest version of the app. Next, let's consider web apps. The pros. Your app is one link and click away. In other words, the user does not have to download your application and install it before they can start using it. As long as they have the link, they can simply click on the link and get to your app. All users are using the latest version of your app. Whenever users visit your web app, if there are any changes that you have made to the web app, the users will be using your app with all those updates. You develop once for multiple devices and operating systems such as Android, iOS, etc., as opposed to the native counterparts, wherein you'd have to develop an application for each operating system. Now let's look at the cons. Unlike native apps, web apps cannot access all features of the device. They are usually slower. They typically cannot be accessed offline. In other words, every time you want to use the web app, you would need to be connected to the internet. In conclusion, your choice of whether to create a native app or a web app is often determined by the type of app you want to create. If your application requires access to things that a web app cannot access, then the choice is simple. In this case, you will have to develop the app for each platform, Android, iOS, etc. On the other hand, if your app can be developed with all of the capabilities that are available to a web app, then this is usually the best route to take. In some cases, to increase your reach, you may consider creating both native and web versions of your app. Take all the social media platforms, for instance, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, etc. Almost all have native apps and web apps that are accessible through a browser. And that brings us to the end of our introduction to programming section. Next up, we'll be diving into web app development.
You can watch other tutorials over here, and most importantly, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so that you don't miss out on tutorials as they come out. Have you subscribed? Are you done? Okay, cool.